Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining Jorge and myself for this seminar. My name's Adrian Smith. I'm Professor of Technology of Society over in the Science Policy Research Unit here at Sussex University. And I had the privilege of being a co-supervisor for Jorge's doctoral research. And I'm serving as chair today to discuss the research that Jorge did as part of his doctoral, as his thesis, doctoral research, but also is continuing to kind of develop and work on. When was it this year you passed your Viva successfully?
March.
March already. Okay.
March.
So Jorge passed his Viva in March after 4 years research and writing, and I must say, is one of the most organised doctoral researchers that I've had the pleasure of co-supervising. Your other supervisor was Jaideep, who at the time was co-coordinating the cities cluster here at IDS. Can't join us now, unfortunately. He's since moved and works at the Arts and Humanities Research Council that keeps him very busy. So that's why he's not here with us. So he did say he would like to have joined if he could. And I think there in the two of us, but also in Jorge's PhD research, what's quite interesting is how it looks at this subject of water supply beyond modern networks and going in deep into the development of rainwater harvesting in Mexico City, as we'll hear, but also how he's worked between the fields of sort of science and technology studies that I'm interested in, and then Jaideep's kind of experience and interest and Jorge's in urban studies and urban development. And that's something Jorge brought with when joining us here for the PhD 4.5 years ago, I think now, having studied urban planning and worked in urban planning in cities in Mexico, mainly Morelia, and then also Colima. We were part of the Global Resilient Cities Network as well. So had very practical experience in trying to help cities to develop. And so with that, as sort of a way of introducing the background, I'll hand over to Jorge, who's going to talk for about 45 minutes. And then we've got plenty of time for kind of questions and observations about the topic. But maybe if some of you are in the middle of your doctoral research, you might even field some questions about how to get to the end as well. Okay, Jorge, so over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. Well, it's great. Finally, after some progression reviews, yesterday when I was preparing my slides, I was taking some slides from the assessment of the first year, the ROS, then some slides from the WIP, that is the review of the third year. And it's great to be finally here with the whole product. I know that there is much more to do because this research needs to turn into papers or a book. But I think it's a good milestone to be here and present the whole project, and then hopefully have some interesting questions and feedback from you. So the title of today is Water Supply Beyond Modern Networks. And I became really interested in this project because you might have heard about the water crisis of Mexico City. And at the point when I was preparing my proposal for the PhD, I was trying to think about a case or a series of cases where I could understand the role of decentralized infrastructure. And I was preparing my proposal, my PhD proposal, when the new mayor of Mexico City launched a citywide program to support rainwater harvesting. So decentralized access to water through rainwater harvesting. So then I thought, well, this might be a very interesting case to address during the PhD. And which I think is, this is, okay. So yeah, during the past four years, almost 5 years now, I've been studying this case, and we're gonna dig into the details of the emergence of rainwater harvesting in Mexico City. The presentation is divided in 3 main sections. First, an overall introduction to the case. Then we are gonna examine the research process, the research questions, the data collection, the analysis, and then we are gonna discuss the main findings and contributions of the research. To start, I want to tell you that one of the first books that I read when I was doing my literature review in the first year was this book, Splintering Urbanism. And this book was really influential, was published more than 20 years now by 2 geographers, Graham and Marvin. And after the publication of this book, happened something that some authors call as the infrastructural turn in social sciences and humanities. And because after the publication of this book, many people started studying infrastructure from the social sciences and humanities, much more than in the past. And basically the thesis of this book says that after 2 centuries of investments in networked infrastructure, they call the modern infrastructural ideal to this paradigm that was looking to have and was promoting the idea of cities that were planned and organized through infrastructure networks. And they, during these past 2 centuries, the main goal of many planners, of many urbanists, was to provide universal, centralized, unitary networks that will provide services for everyone in the city. And then the city will be organized as a result of these networks. So the idea was to have like this notion of the network city. And what these authors, apart from explaining that phenomenon, what they suggested is that we were, because of neoliberalism, we were entering in a period where we didn't have these bundled systems anymore. And we were starting to have like an unbundling of networks, and we were having like private actors offering new options of access to services. So when this happened, many people started to talk about this, but many authors were also criticizing this thesis, because in the Global South, this idea of the whole city connected through networks was, this never happened. Like infrastructure networks have never been universalized in the Global South. So many authors were also criticizing this idea, because how can we assume that infrastructure networks are being, this unbundled if they were never connected? We have, in the Global South, we have a reality that I took this term an incomplete modernity, because that notion of the network city never happened as a whole. So we have, of course, we have infrastructure networks in almost every city in the Global South, but they have never been universalized. So we have at the same time different ways in which people access to services, and particularly in terms of water. Like, for example, we have these pictures of Mexico City. We have many people that have access to water through water, these tanker trucks, or many people have access to water through moving the water with animals or with bicycles or with many, they access to water through many different ways. So that ideal of the network city doesn't really work fully in the global south. We have more than 600 million people all over the world that they don't have access to safely managed water, that according to UNICEF is water that is accessible in the premises, water that is available when needed, and water that is clean. And sometimes not even having access to infrastructure, to the infrastructure network, means that you're going to have the service. For example, in Latin America, we have the urban, 96% of the urban population has access to the pipelines, but only around 80% have access to water when it's needed and water that is clean. So you might have the tap, but there is no water in that tap, or the water that comes through that tap is not clean. So I decided to use this term to express how access to water is in Mexico City and how it is in many other cities of the global south. And this notion of an incompleteness of the modern infrastructural ideal is also something that clashes with that big promise of modernity. And I want to show you one example. For those who have been in Mexico City, have you, I know that at least you, Evelyn, you have been there because have you been in this place? No? What, do you know what is this place?
No, there's a monument in Chapultepec.
It's in Chapultepec. So this is a museum now. So this place is called Cárcamo de Dolores. So this place that is now a museum, that is in one section of the biggest park in Mexico City, it was actually, this was inaugurated in the 50s. And this was a place where, so now 40% of water that is consumed in Mexico City comes from other basins. Before that, like the water supply was coming 100% from rivers or from underground. So when this is the place where an interbasin transfer system, the first interbasin transfer system, was where it was the water that was brought from other basins. This is the place that the water was coming into the city. So the engineers at that time, they wanted to have a place where we could recognize that we are bringing water from far away, and all that water is coming through this place. And there is so inside this museum, there is this pool. It's like a pool, it's like a box of water. So we have, this is like the big pipe that is bringing water from another basin. This interbasin transfer system is called Lerma system, Sistema Lerma. Then there was another one bigger, the Cutzamala system, that they were built to bring water from distant locations. And to recognize that this water was coming through to the city, they built this like this pool where they have a mural from a very famous muralist in Mexico, Diego Rivera, and also famous internationally. So here, so you see, they built for many years this system that will bring water from far away. And to celebrate that water is coming, we are gonna create this mural where we recognize the value of water and the value of water, how water is so important for life. And they recognize, like they have here, a representation showing how water was important for the creation of life, how even it has a recreational value. They recognize the engineers that built this system. So this was the promise of modernity. Like, we have the infrastructure, we have the technology to bring water from far away. But this celebration of technology never achieved its promise, because we have never had in the past 70 years a universal provision of water. And what we have is this incomplete modernity that I was mentioning. So we have good service in the central areas. So we have, this is the other system, the Kutsamala system, and it brings water from, even from a different state, and through a series of pumps, we have to elevate the water 1 kilometer up. So the energy that is consumed every single day by this system is the same energy that a city of 2 million people consume. So we have this system every single day bringing water from far away, but that resource is only distributed in the central, mostly the planned areas of the city. So in the rest part, in the peripheries, we see how these red parts are where we have higher water precarity. So less like the supply is intermittent, or the supply is of bad quality, or the neighborhoods, they don't have access to the network. So we have this, many authors have suggested this as a crisis, as a water crisis of the city. But as we see, it's a crisis that is unique. Well, it's a crisis that is differential, because it's not experienced the same way if you live in one of these central neighborhoods or if you live in the peripheries of the city. And because of this problem, during the past 15 years, there has been an alternative that has been supported by many stakeholders and by the local government, that is rainwater harvesting. So some decades ago, rainwater harvesting was an idea that was suggested in some forums, in some technical documents, but during the past 15 years, there have been many projects and many programs that have supported the implementation of this decentralized infrastructure. And I'm going to show you more or less how it works. When I was just starting my PhD, I was telling you that the mayor launched this program, and they were planning to install systems, rainwater harvesting systems that work more or less this way. So we have in common houses, particularly houses in those water scarce areas of the city. So we use the roof to collect water, then the water goes through a series of pipes and filters, and then it goes to a storage tank. During the time I was doing my PhD, that was also coincidentally the time that the previous mayor was in power, over 73,000 systems like this one were installed. And so this is a huge change, because even when it's symbolical, it's the contribution to the water supply of the city is still small, that we are installing this kind of decentralized infrastructure all over the city is an interesting change. So I wanted to, through the PhD, I wanted to examine this phenomenon in detail. And so I reviewed 3 streams of literature to understand this phenomenon theoretically. One is the literature from human geography, from post-colonial studies that recognize that we need to rethink infrastructure, and we need to interpret infrastructure beyond the notion of the networks as the only way to provide services in cities, beyond the notion of the networked city. Secondly, I reviewed also literature from political ecology, where that interprets urban infrastructures as configurations in cities that have a metabolism. So we have an input, then the energy or the water, the materials or the energy, they are distributed through infrastructures, and then there is an output. And that metabolism, those flows of energy and matter, they are shaped by political relations. And then the third stream of literature that I reviewed is socio-technical transitions. And through this literature, we can interpret that technologies, infrastructures, they change over time, they transition. So we have one of the main frameworks that is a multi-level perspective, for example, interprets that we have changes in paradigms, big changes or shocks that happen like at a wider level. And those changes, those developments, they put pressure over the regimes. In this case, the main regime is the network. Then those regimes, they get destabilized, and then innovations can change those regimes or replace them. So those were like the theoretical foundations of my study. But to organize some of those theoretical constructs, I developed, well, I will show the framework later. So this informed my initial theoretical understanding of the research. And then I developed the study. So this was a qualitative study, as some authors call Big Q, because the data was qualitative and the analysis was qualitative. So I was not trying to gather data or statistics. I was trying to understand the details of the process, the details of this social and technological change process. And I focused in the city. I recognize that this is a process that is happening at a metropolitan scale, but I focused in Mexico City, in the capital of the country. And I had one main question, that is, so how alternative infrastructure, like rainwater harvesting, how is incorporated into cities where modern networks do not provide universal and reliable services? So that was the overarching question. And then I had three particular questions or sub-research questions. One, so why is that the network in Mexico City has failed in this promise of modernity, of providing universal and reliable services, and how that has opened opportunity for other arrangements like rainwater harvesting? The second is how rainwater harvesting facilities have emerged in this context, and what socio-technical complexities arise from the role of this alternative technology in the city. And then the third is how power relations are changing or not as a result of this phenomenon. And then I was mentioning the theory, and I developed this analytical framework. So we have, at the landscape level, so we have some water management paradigms, approaches. Most city leaders and the engineers in the water utilities, they have some frameworks, some understanding of water management that they implement at the local level. And then we have service regimes. In the case of Mexico City, the main regime is the the local utility, that is a public local utility, Sistema de Aguas of Mexico City, the water system, that this system gets water from groundwater wells and from those interbasin transfer systems that I was telling you at the beginning. Then this system provides water to the pipelines, and we have some neighborhoods like the central neighborhoods that I was showing you, that they have reliable supply. Then we have other neighborhoods where the supply is insufficient. They have access to the network, they have service, they have water in their taps, but it's not enough. And then because we don't have everyone with enough supply, we have alternative arrangements. And then we have the tanker trucks that they complement the supply in these neighborhoods. Some of them are public, they are subsidized by the government, some are private. And then here is where there is an opportunity for rainwater harvesting, because it's supplementing or complementing the supply in those neighborhoods where there is not enough supply from the network. And we see that there is a metabolism, there are water flows going from these water sources through the network and through the alternative service arrangements, and then the new alternative that is rainwater harvesting. So I interviewed many people. I interviewed experts, academics, people that use rainwater harvesting, public officials, politicians. I also visited 6 neighborhoods where rainwater harvesting has been installed. And I reviewed many documents, policy documents, technical documents, films. There are many documentaries about this problem out there. And so these are the people I interviewed. I had 2 different groups of interviewees. One that I named the supply side are like the more institutional actors, that they might be involved in water supply, or they might be involved in the projects of rainwater harvesting. And then the demand side, that are mainly rainwater harvesting users. Rainwater harvesting users that maybe they adopted this technology because of this program of the previous mayor, or because they got this technology through other projects. There are also philanthropic projects that have supported this technology. And we know that the focus of this research is in those areas where the service is not reliable, but also to compare, I interviewed some people from the central areas that have also adopted this technology. The analysis was, so here was the interesting part. I interviewed 65 people, and then I got transcripts of those 65 interviews. And then I followed the method of these authors, Brown and Clark. The method is called thematic analysis. And then the process was like this. So I had the transcripts. Then I coded every piece of text of those transcripts. So let's say we have this transcript from the interview, and then there is one part of the interview that the participant is mentioning something about certain topic, and then there is a code. Then the conversation goes in a different direction, then I add another code. So I have a series of codes, and every fragment of every interview was coded. But then I had to organize those codes into teams. And then I developed teams that were fewer. But you see, the codes and those fragments of text are like the Legos. The teams are like, something that we are building with those Legos. And those teams, then, they were unpacked in the empirical chapters of the thesis. So I'm going to show you, for example, for the first research question, I had all these codes of different issues that were addressed by the participants through the interviews. For example, problems around planning and decision-making, housing policies, informality, governance of the network, social awareness of people in terms of the water crisis. And then these codes, of course, some of those codes were discarded because they were not relevant to respond to research questions. But then I kept some of them, and then to respond the first research question, there were two main themes that will be useful to respond that question. And those themes were built by codes that each code includes a series of text fragments. So at the end, for each research question, I had a series of themes, and this was the thematic map. When I was interviewing my participants, I always tell them, I used to tell them that I was trying to organize the pieces of a puzzle, because this research is like a picture of what has been happening in Mexico City over the past 5 years. And each participant had a piece of that puzzle. And I was organizing the different pieces to have the picture of what was happening. And this is like a representation of that puzzle that we organized. So we have the main research question. Then we have the first sub-research question. And then here we have two main themes that respond to this research question. And here we have the codes that I was telling you. There are less codes because some of those codes were not relevant, right? And then we have the same for the second research question, and then for the third research question as well. So it's the same information that is gathered through the interviews, but fragmented in different codes and then organized to respond to these research questions. And now we are going to address what was found from those conversations. First, to respond to the first one, the first sub-research question about, so why is that the network, after 1 century, has not been able to reach everyone in the city? The first modern water system was built 100 years ago. In 1910, the first infrastructure that will bring potable water from the south of the city to the center was built. And after 1 century, it hasn't been possible to provide potable water reliably and universally. So why is that? When I was asking this question to my participants, of course, the response depends on who you ask the question. And when I was asked, for example, I had the opportunity to interview many current and previous high officials at the local utility. And when you will ask the engineers, for example, those chief engineers, they will always say, well, we don't have enough money. If we have more budget, we could have a better supply, and we could cover more people. Some others will say, well, the problem is that we don't have enough water. The problem is that there are management problems. We don't have enough knowledge to implement the policies that we have, or we have the technological solutions, but then we have mayors coming every 6 years at the city level, and then we have mayors in the boroughs coming every 3 years. So there were different explanations to the same problem. But what I found, and this is a very interesting picture, because when I was doing fieldwork in 2021, there was an important drought in the city. And there was this emergency because there was the drought. It was the worst drought in many years. And you see the mayor, now the president of the country, she gives this message in this video, and she says, look, we are monitoring here the network, and we are trying to send water for the areas where we don't have enough, but it's important that you don't waste water. But you see, from only a technical perspective or a technological perspective, the problem is that we have a system that we need maybe more money, or we need more knowledge, but we have this system that we need to enhance so it can provide water for everyone. But for example, if I go, I will come back. And also that was the same reasoning. So this was a previous chief engineer from the water utility. And he was telling me, look, the problem is that we have many people that settle in areas that are unplanned. So they go and they settle there, and then by law, we cannot provide water there. So this is a problem, right? As if, so we have on the one hand, we have this technical perspective, like we need more money, we need more knowledge. And we have this perspective where, oh, if we have people that are settled in areas where we cannot provide water, then that is a problem, as if it was an exception. But what happens? Half of the city has been built informally. So there is no way, there is no money, there is no technical enhancement that can supply water for a big portion of the city that legally you don't have the means to provide water. So what I found in this chapter is that, yes, we have environmental challenges, we have technical challenges, there are different kinds of challenges that the network faces. But obviously, or not, the main problem that restricts access to water in the city are structural inequalities. Because we have, over the past century, we have had large portions of the population that they haven't had access to proper housing, and they have had to live informally. And then while you are in an informal settlement, you cannot have formal permanent infrastructure. So you always have this gap. You always have thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that they are rejected from the network because they haven't found proper ways to access housing, to access the city. So we have different technical problems, but in reality, this incompleteness is an expression of structural inequalities. So because we have always a portion of the population that is rejected from the main system, we need to have parallel systems that provide water to those populations. So that was the response very briefly to the first question. Then the second question, that was mainly about the story of rainwater harvesting. We see, if you look, for example, rainwater harvesting in Mexico City, you will find many media articles that they say, look at the innovators there, because there is one social enterprise that has been the main actor providing this technology. And many times we see, if we talk about infrastructure, we think only as like we are talking about a technology. But in this account that I made of this process, we see that changes happen not only because of the technological aspect, but also because other changes in law, in regulation. So in 2008, that is the year that many participants recognize as the beginning, there was a reform, the beginning or the inception of this niche. There was a reform to the local water law that was suggesting that big buildings should have rainwater harvesting facilities. Then 1 year after, the main companies in the city, they were founded. Some of them addressing this demand from the water law reform. And then some of them, particularly this one, Isla Urbana, they developed their own system. So, and then we started having some local devices developed by these organizations. And you see 2008, and then by 2016, we have the first citywide policy. So we had to wait after the law reform and after we have some entrepreneurs experimenting and creating new devices, then we started having policies. And then we had more updates in terms of policy. And then in 2019, we had the first, the largest citywide policy that after this is when we had over 70,000 systems installed. So we see that it's a process where you not only need the technological arrangements, but also we had different changes, for example, in terms of narratives. And one of my participants mentioned this. This is a person that works for one of the main rainwater harvesting companies. And he was telling me, so they were the main providers of the government during the first year of the policy. Then they were taken out and the government was buying the systems to a different company. But despite that, he told me this. So he told me, look, this is the first time we are seeing real change in terms of this technology. Because 5 years ago, we already had the knowledge, this technology was already proven, but we didn't have the political will. And he explained, because we had this notion of some of the chief engineers that if rainwater harvesting doesn't provide 100% of the demand, then it's useless. And he was telling me, we had this change, this cognitive change, that we can support a technology that will not provide 100% of the demand, will provide maybe will cover a small amount of the demand, but nevertheless is important. This is relevant, that more portion. So we see that, for example, there was an earthquake in 2017, and after the earthquake in some areas of the city, the supply was disrupted. And because the supply from the network was disrupted, the only people that had access to water were those that were collecting rainwater, because the earthquake was in September during the rainy season. So we see that this niche that has been changing the regime slowly over the past 15 years, through this case, we see that is not only the technology, and particularly this technology has been relevant because the industrial designers that developed this technology specifically to address the demand of those people that have been bypassed by the network. And that's why it became practical, because it became practical for politicians, because it reduces the pressure of the social demand. And then, so we see this journey where we have the changes, technological changes, we have changes in policy, we have changes in regulations, we have changes in the perception of the technology, we have changes in narratives, and we have different new actors supporting the deployment of this alternative. And then finally, the third empirical chapter that addresses the third question about how power relations are changing. The first thing that I noticed when I was developing, or the first argument that I was elaborating when I was developing this chapter, was around the idea that you saw at the beginning that I explained that the water crisis is experienced differentially. So different people have, some people are not aware of the crisis because they have good supply, and some people suffer the crisis every day. So the experience of rainwater harvesting is also differentiated, because we have some people that have adopted the technology despite they have good supplies, but they have adopted the technology because they want to unplug themselves from the network. They say, I have good supply, but this supply is polluting because we are bringing the water from far away. So I want to be like more environmentally conscious, so I'm going to install this in my home. Then we have some other populations that the supply might be insufficient, and they can access one of these devices through policies of the city. So there is a demand that is not satisfied, and then the state is helping them with this alternative. And then we have the people that are living currently in informal settlements, that they don't have access to the network, that they are the ones that suffer the most acute scarcity, and they don't even have access to the subsidies of the state. So the same reasons that exclude them from network supply are the same reasons that exclude them from the alternative. So the experience of rainwater harvesting is also differentiated. And maybe for the more privileged users, it's only a change of habits. So I installed this device in my home. Yes, maybe the water has some, it smells differently, and I made this investment, and now like I'm adapting, but it's not a big deal. While the people that are living at these margins of the city, like this participant, she told me that she migrated from another state. She had her house in the state where she's from, but she migrated to a plot around here, and she didn't have access to any services, and she was having a really hard time. She wanted to go back, but she was there because she knew that when her kids will be in the age of secondary school, high school, she knew that in her town, there was no secondary school, only primary school. So she immigrated to the city because she wanted to provide better education for her kids, despite they were suffering because they didn't have access to water. And she was about to go back to her town when she had access to one of these devices. And now 8 months of the year, she gets water from rainwater harvesting. So 8 months of the year, she got a solution for her water demand. So, and these particular users that are the ones that are suffering the most, they cannot even access rainwater harvesting through the policies of the state. They have to access through philanthropic projects. But you see how maybe the percentage of water supply at the city level might be symbolic, but for many people, this changes lives, and this changes the political relations that they have with the actors that supply water, because at least for this case, 8 months of the year, you don't need to go to the government office to request a tanker truck, a subsidized tanker truck. And then you don't need to wait that the tanker truck can arrive to your house any day of the month at any time. Many people that they wait for those tanker trucks, they need to have someone at home during the whole month because the tanker truck might arrive. And it's the only way that you can access water. And then you need to give a tip to the tanker truck, or maybe you need to support to some politicians because then they will allocate more funding for tanker trucks to your neighborhood. So those political relationships and those engagements are relieved during 8 months. So to finish, and so we can start the discussion, what can we learn from this case study? I think there are 3 main lessons that we can learn in general terms. One is that there is a need to embrace infrastructural plurality. So during the past century, the focus in planning, the focus in policy was on extending centralized networks, which have been very useful. But that's not the only way to access services. Now we have, for example, decentralized sanitation, decentralized access to electricity. So the decline of the hegemony of networks is opening possibilities for other decentralized alternatives like rainwater harvesting. And there are many other, for other service demands, there are many other technologies that fortunately, because of this change, they are being taken seriously by policy like rainwater harvesting. Then also in terms of transitions research, it's important to recognize the local context. One of the critiques that I elaborate in the thesis, I don't know if you might agree, Adrian, but is that most of the research in socio-technical transitions has focused on the environment, on environmental sustainability. So how can we develop a new technology that replaces a polluting one? Assuming that there is a polluting one in the first place that we have to replace, right? And the field of socio-technical transitions has been absorbed by this main guiding principle of sustainability. But there are other problems that require socio-technical change. Like in this case, of course, 1 liter of water that is captured from the rain consumes less carbon than 1 liter of water that was brought from a different basin and it came here through the pipeline, and we invested a lot of energy to bring the water here. Yes, it is a cleaner liter of water, but that's not the main reason why this technology became relevant. The main reason this technology became relevant in Mexico City, it was because it was alleviating a social demand. And it was alleviating a social struggle of not having water when it's needed. So we need to understand the different particularities of local contexts. What are the local development goals? And what new socio-technical arrangements, what new technologies we need in place? And finally, that as with any technology, and in this case with decentralization of infrastructure, there are ambivalent outcomes. And in this case, what we see is that we see that there is a new metabolic flow being enabled. So there is water that rainfall that previously was not being used, and now is being directed to the consumption of certain populations. That is fine, and it is relieving the stress of those populations. And despite it will not change the system, it's making their life easier. But at the same time, when we support these alternatives, then also we are putting the focus on the alternatives, and then we are not questioning the consumption of the certain populations in the city and the need for redistribution of the resources that we have already in place. And also, because this is relieving pressure in the system, is also relieving the possibility of the system being pressured enough to then being in the position of deploying maybe more radical solutions, and not only supplementary solutions like rainwater harvesting. So when we support rainwater harvesting, which is great, we are not questioning the consumption of the elites, and we are not questioning, despite it's the same state that is providing the alternatives, we are not questioning why the state cannot provide universal and reliable supply. So it's just something to be careful about. So finally, this case shows how new infrastructural alternatives can be incorporated in context of incomplete modernity, as I mentioned in this case, where we don't have universal and reliable access to services. Also, how innovations developed by entrepreneurs can be instrumentalized by the state to relieve those pressures of those mainstream regimes. And finally, if we learn from this study that is about one technology in one city in the global south, I think if we learn from this case and other similar cases, we can understand better, and we can also have more knowledge to support transitions that are specifically addressing the needs of underserviced populations. So I'm going to leave it here so we can have at least half hour for questions and discussion. So thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jorge. I've accompanied Jorge on the doctoral research process, so you think I'd kind of be, you know, okay, I've heard all this before, but actually it was really, really fascinating, Jorge, really clearly presented. I like the way you kind of set up this challenge really of incomplete modernity and how to change the way we think about infrastructures, and then presenting why this case was important. And it was really good, I think, to have the research process you went through and to arrive at these really, really interesting kind of conclusions. So we have until about just 20 minutes or so for questions until 1:30. We're recording, so I think I'll kind of hand you a microphone. If you raise your hand, anyone who'd like to ask a question or make an observation, we'd like to start.
The session is being recorded, so if you don't want that your question is kept like for the recording that will be available on YouTube, so just say like, so we can eliminate that part.
Hi. Thanks, Jorge. That was so interesting. I've been with you on your journey as well, as a peer in the PhD room, and I've heard you talk about your work, but I've never really understood it in that kind of depth. And you know, it's really interesting. The two questions I had, one was about the kind of politics of kind of struggle in terms of the people on the periphery getting less water, and whether this is a hot potato issue politically in Mexico City come elections, and people arguing that they're going to do something about it, and whether there is any kind of political organization around those who are receiving insufficient supplies or not getting any, and whether that came across with your qualitative work in the community. And also I was going to ask in terms of sort of climate change and, you know, in terms of reliance on new innovations, but how reliable are they going to be with the changing climate? And I don't know enough about sort of the projections around Mexico City and what that's going to look like. But I just wanted to ask, you know, is this just a short-term fix for those in need? And actually, I did have a third question around taxing. How, you know, is there, and this probably links to the political organisation question in terms of how people are being taxed on the periphery in comparison with elites and getting so little in terms of water provision in comparison, and whether that's an issue that came up as well. Thank you.
Do you want to answer them, and then I'll head to the next person? Yeah.
Sure. It definitely is the water crisis is definitely a hot potato. And every time there is an election in the debates, there is always a section of what are you going to do, candidate, to address the water crisis. What we see interesting for this case is that at least since the election of the previous mayor, 3 out of 4 candidates, if I remember well, were suggesting rainwater harvesting. So this is something that is now in the public opinion. And the hot potato is the water crisis, and it's one of the different ways that now politicians are trying to patch up the problem. Interestingly, as well, regarding the political organizations, Adrian, during the whole 4 years, was asking me, are there like political grassroots movements, or are there organizations like being gathered around this solution? And interestingly as well, I couldn't find in 4 years. And that's also an interesting critique to rainwater harvesting, because of course there has been grassroots mobilization, very important grassroots mobilization over the past 50, 60, 80 decades. But this is not a solution that is coming from those grassroots organizations. It's a solution that is coming from relatively privileged designers, very, very talented, but it's not a solution that is coming from the people that are excluded. It's a solution that is coming through philanthropic organizations, social enterprises, and then it has been adopted by policy. In terms of climate change, we know that as we might have more intense droughts, we might have more intense rain. So I think it works both ways to have a plan B, some kind of redundancy in terms of water access. And in terms of tax, this is an important aspect, because of course richer populations pay more taxes, and that pays better infrastructure. And it is interesting that for the rainwater harvesting program, one of the requirements was to show a tax receipt. So you are being excluded socioeconomically, and then when there is an alternative, you're also being excluded because maybe you live in an informal settlement where you don't pay taxes. So that's an interesting layer of the program as well.
Okay. Conveniently, there's two questions here
Sure.
next to one another. So please, but let's take both of them and then you can answer. Yeah. So you first.
Thank you, Jorge. You're a great presenter and an inspiration for us all PhD students.
Thank you.
My question is, in one of your learnings, you talked about embracing infrastructural plurality. I'm wondering, what does that look like in theory and in practice? Would they be the same or different, considering the practice might be different because of the local context?
I think there is one.
Okay,
Sorry,
take the
sorry.
second question.
Okay, hello, Jorge. Thank you for your presentation. I learned many new things about my city. And well, I had a couple of questions. First of all, you talk about, okay, like embracing infrastructural plurality and maybe going away of these big infrastructure projects. But I wonder if there can also be like a big infrastructural solution to the problem, in the sense that if it is possible to restore the lake that once used to be Mexico City, no? Because we have floodings all the time, and maybe we could make a sponge city or some crazy idea like that. I don't know if there's a possibility of harvest all of the water again from our own soil. The other problem is what would happen with the system of the Mezquital Valley, because lots of our water that we harvest from other states, then it goes as wastewater to the places where we grow our food. So it's also like one of the trade-offs, no? Like we would be compromising the agriculture in those parts. And well, apart from these like big infrastructure questions, I had my question has a lot to do with the previous question. Like maybe in the short term, water harvesting creates political relations when they are installing it, when you need to be tax registered, etc. But in the long run, maybe it might reduce this politics of water, this collective bargaining for water, these clientelar networks for water even. So what do you think it will imply for the socio-political fabric of communities in the long term?
Thank you. Okay, Jorge.
I think there is a very practical way to understand infrastructural plurality. And I think all of us, we have seen that while being at the top of a building in a city, 50 years ago, we will see like only the rooftops. And if we go now, we will see solar heaters, solar PV systems, and now in Mexico City, we will see also rainwater harvesting systems. So the notion of infrastructural plurality is not that we will not need networks anymore, but that there are other solutions beyond just increasing the supply. So there are other solutions, for example, in terms of energy, beyond increasing the energy supply through the network, because you can access energy through other ways. And in terms of water, in terms of the water supply of the city, so there is more beyond just bringing more and more cubic meters of water, bringing that water from other distant sources, and then just taking out the wastewater, which is that linear system is what has been mainstream over the past century. So it's not that networks are not important, but that there are other ways as well that can complement and can supplement supply. And for example, the comment of Emilio is relevant in this term because maybe, for example, increasing the supply is not, it doesn't need to be necessarily bringing water from long distance, but like promoting infiltration and then having more availability in the same aquifer. So it's being open to diversity and how different ways complement each other to address a demand of a service, in this case of potable water. So I think that many participants that I interviewed see this same way, that rainwater harvesting is not the solution of the crisis, of course, but it's one alternative that needs to be incorporated along with many other alternatives, like restoring the lakes, like restoring the ecosystems, reducing the consumption, improving efficiency in the consumption. So all of that needs to come together to fix the crisis, and not only increasing the demand. Because of this notion of only increasing the demand and then taking the wastewater out is why we have the issue of the Valle of Mezquital, that we send all the wastewater to one place, and then that is useful for growing food. There will be a point, if this niche keeps growing, according to some of my participants, there will be a point where there will be some tensions. I don't think, and this might be the job for a more quantitative researcher, but I don't think we have enough water tanks to capture enough water to compromise the wastewater that is being used to grow food. But I think there might be a point of tension in the coming years if this keeps growing, for example, with the tanker truck operators, because they make business out of selling very expensive water to people in need. So if this keeps growing, and then almost every house in the periphery has a rainwater harvesting tank, then that will compromise the market of tanker trucks. There might be, I think that's a tension that is more possible. And of course, that connects with what you were saying. I didn't mention it because I didn't have enough time, but those people, those populations that struggle from water scarcity, also, they are more vulnerable to be politically captured politically through clientelism. Because if you are a politician and then you have a neighborhood that is not connected to a network, then you can go and say, hey, look, vote for me and then I will fix this. Or if you are a tanker truck operator and then you have to bring that water that is subsidized to a neighborhood, and then you tell the people, oh, look, if you give me a better tip, I will go to your house first, and then I will supply the other ones. So this solution also helps to being relieved from those clientelism and domination relationships from actors, intermediaries that have control of water in those neighborhoods.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jorge. Any more questions? One here, and then I'll come over. Okay. Let's just take, because we've got about 10 minutes. I see three, so let's just gather them up, and then you can answer, Jorge. Yeah. please go ahead.
Jorge, thank you so much. And maybe others in the room are, but for those that aren't rainwater specialists, it was really clearly set out for all of us, including your research and how you analysed your data. So really thank you for taking us on that journey. My questions relate one to the research questions. Your overarching research question talked about alternative technologies, alternative systems, but yet your research really focused on rainwater harvesting. To what extent do you feel that your findings are actually applicable to other alternatives, if there are in Mexico City, or others that you might have seen spring up over the years of your research? And the second was part of your findings of your research were around power. And I wondered to what extent you'd kind of taken your findings to more kind of policy levels, and what your thoughts were with how you might take your research forward now, and to what extent, in reality, any alternative technology would miss out on the most marginalised parts of society, in which case, is any alternative actually helping the majority, if not just the elite? My questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Right. Hold on a second, Jorge. I'm going to come round. Get the second one. There you go. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Jorge, for an excellent presentation. I have two questions. I'm very intrigued by your reflective analysis process. And given your familiarity with the topic and you are from Mexico City, I was wondering, was there any findings that surprised you? Or like, basically out of your expectation? And the second one, regarding alternative technology, I was wondering how was the response of the official government or the state regarding this alternative technology? Would this option will be adopted or mainstream in their program? Or would it be, and for your personal opinion, would it be better to stay as an alternative technology and managed not by the state? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, there you go.
Thank you. It was really interesting. I was just wondering, how did rainwater harvesting come about as the, how did it gain favour as far as legislative and policy programming went with regard to other alternative technologies? I was also wondering if you came across anything that showed how you could incentivize more alternative technology innovation with regard to development problems like water crises. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Okay, Jorge.
Okay, just let me. So the first was Charlie, right? From this round. Well, I think some learnings from this case are useful for other technological alternatives, and that's why that was my intention at the beginning. Actually, when I was writing the proposal, I wanted to study PV systems in Puerto Rico because there was a hurricane in 2017 that disrupted all the service networks. And then, as in the case of the earthquake in Mexico City, the first people that had access to electricity after the hurricane in Puerto Rico were those who had access to PV systems. And also, for example, in you know, all the movies, they show the informal settlements of Brazilian cities, you know, the favelas. There have been interesting decentralized systems for processing wastewater. I wanted to examine other cases, but you have to reduce your scope. But I think maybe I didn't use like the specific terms of the literature for this presentation, but I think this can be useful to try to understand other technological processes with other technologies addressing other problems in context of the Global South, in context where you are trying to understand how a new socio-technical configuration is addressing a social demand. I think particularly in terms of transitions literature, this has been a demand from the past years that many people are suggesting addressing these social and technological changes in the global south and in cities of the global south. So I think this is relevant to add to that conversation. Also in terms of power and policy, and this connects with another question. I think it's, of course, for someone like me, I became interested originally in this alternative because it was sustainable, because it shows you how to address a demand from a different perspective. But it became interesting for politicians at the moment where this alternative was making their job easier. And for example, for the previous mayor, when she won and before her term started, she had, I know from conversations with my participants that she had a meeting with some scholars and other innovators that have been supporting this initiative. And she asked them like, okay, how many of them do we need to install to address the most vulnerable? And they said 100,000. Okay, how much is that? This amount. Ah, that's so cheap. That was high reaction. So I think in the moment that this alternative was being practical and was relieving a political demand that is the issue of the water crisis, it became relevant. And it became something that moved from discussions in forums like this to reality, because then mayors of the borough and the mayors of Mexico City, they started to see that this was something that was going to help them. And also, this is, I didn't document this very well, but I assume this is happening, or at least some people have mentioned, some of my participants. I think also populations that are facing water scarcity, if there are many ways, many things that they could demand from the government, I think rainwater harvesting is becoming another thing that can be requested to alleviate their situation. So I think to respond, Hesting, I think the response of the government has been to support this because it's being helpful for them. In terms of what was surprising, it's difficult to recall right now because I've been repeating this for some time because I did the analysis 2 years ago. But something that I remember now is that it was very difficult to interview the entrepreneurs that are like the entrepreneurs of the leading organization that is supporting rainwater harvesting, because they are so busy. So I interviewed like the main entrepreneur at the end. And I started interviewing some people that might have some more critical perspectives. And I remember they saying, no, the promoters of rainwater harvesting, they sell this as the solution of the crisis, and it is not, and the government should not be spending money on it. And then when I finally had the opportunity to interview them, like they were aware that this was not the solution, that this was only one alternative. That's why I suggested as an alternative. So also in the public discussion, those conflicting narratives also they get distorted, and I think that's why it's important to do this kind of research, because each actor has a different version of the story. And then if we have the time to put in perspective all the different opinions, then we can have a more comprehensive perspective of what is happening, rather than different views from conflicting actors that they might not speak to each other very frequently.